I'm outside of Parliament because I had an interview with Lord Pearson, and there are a bunch of Remainer protesters with some Brexiteers, and may as well go down and see if we can cause some trouble.
I'm well aware that this is a bit unfair to engage in a debate with someone who can't answer back, and by and large, I think that the people Sargon talked to did a pretty good job. The first guy I think I remember from one of the marches that I went on, he certainly seemed very well informed then and seems to know his stuff. But still, I thought I would reply as if he was asking the questions to me. Yeah, if he wants to do a response or something, he can, I guess. I would doubt it. I'm a piddling small YouTuber, and I'm well aware that I am overdoing the EU and Brexit content at the moment, but what the fuck, views are in the toilet anyway due to some opaque changes at YouTube that seem to have slashed all the views for everything in half for some reason. I've got no idea why, so I might as well be self-indulgent and get things like this off my chest. So at least I'm getting something out of it. Now, to get a few things out of the way first, I don't think you're stupid necessarily if you voted for Brexit. I don't think you're racist necessarily if you voted for Brexit. As someone said, I'm going to go over this again very slowly, not everyone who voted for Brexit was racist, but virtually all racists did vote for Brexit. Do you understand? That's not calling you a racist, it's just pointing out the people who are xenophobic and afraid of foreigners and don't like the wogs. They are people who voted for Brexit. That's the company you're in. It doesn't mean anything. That would be a genetic fallacy, but it is nonetheless true. Okay, so I don't think you're stupid. I don't necessarily think you're racist. Low information voter isn't an insult. It just means that these are complicated issues with lots of moving parts that lots of people aren't particularly informed on. You know, even people who are vehement about it and have put a shitload of money into backing Brexit and arguing for it don't seem to know what it is exactly that they object to. So even people with wealth and power and influence, like what's his name from Wetherspoons, you know, he can't name any EU laws that he finds particularly difficult, and the basis of his objections maybe seems to be workers' rights and so on, which are a fairly big thing in Europe. So perhaps he's being dishonest, perhaps he's just genuinely ignorant. You know, I don't know everything about everything. I have to defer to experts, and that's not an argument from authority. It's that there is a very broad consensus around experts about these things, and these are the people who know about what they're speaking of. I've made my own personal arguments in previous videos about why I think we should still remain in the EU and why we should have a second referendum. So I won't waste too much time on that unless it comes up. But there are some typical objections that people have that I reject, and I would go over first. Okay? One of the big objections that Brexiters seem to have towards the EU is that we're somehow dictated to by Brussels, that we have somehow incurred a loss of sovereignty and local decision making and so on. This may be a definitional or paradigmal issue, but I don't see that the same way. Think of it like this. I participate in Britain's democracy within my local seat. I vote. My vote has never counted for anything because this is a safe Tory seat, but you know, I participate in the democratic process and I return an MP for this area. Never the one I choose, but again, beside the point. Meanwhile, Dave from Liverpool votes for whoever he votes for and returns an MP. Both of our MPs go to Parliament and they make decisions and so on that affect both of us, me and Dave, all of us. I am not being dictated to by Liverpool because I'm under the same government in a democratic process that I participate in. I would only be being dictated to if I had no say at all. If I wasn't returning anybody to Parliament, if I wasn't voting at local, regional, national, and in this case international elections. So we participate. So there is no loss of sovereignty. There is no being dictated to that takes place there. It doesn't happen. We're part of a larger structure. I think decisions should take place at the appropriate level. So international issues should be resolved at an international level. National issues should be resolved at a national level. Regional issues at a regional level. Local issues at a local level, and so on. But to object in this way, to claim that Europe is a dictatorship or we're somehow being forced or whatever, when it's a process that we're involved in, seems to me to be just completely wrong-headed. And that really seems to be the real only thing that people talk about, that they feel dictated to, that they feel that they're being ruled from Brussels. And I don't think that's true any more than someone in one area or another is being dictated to by a Westminster particularly. So I'm not particularly sympathetic to Scottish nationalist movements or Welsh nationalist movements because they participate, so they're not being dictated to per se. Of course, now run run from the rest of us and get back into Europe as fast as you can. So yeah, that's that.
What we're aiming to do, I guess, is to put the case for remaining in the European Union.
Could you explain that case?
I've gone into my reasons why I think we should still remain many times. Go back a few videos, you'll find one where I do the whole ethos, pathos, logos breakdown of the arguments for it, but there's no harm in a quick summary, I suppose. Even if there was nothing else, the sheer amount of illegality and bullshit surrounding the original vote should be enough. I mean, it's not in question now that there was illegality, overspending, various shenanigans, interference, Cambridge Analytica, and so on going on. And in any normal situation, that should invalidate the vote and create the need for a new, much more vigilantly watched, under control and uncorrupted one. But these are not normal times. The economic case is obvious. Was it 80% of investment in the car industry in the UK has fallen away over the last 3 years? If we go with a no-deal Brexit, the economy could suffer by as much as 10%. And to put that in context for you, the Great Recession was about 2 to 3% slowdown and so forth. So that gives you some kind of idea. I think all of the promises of the Leave camp have fallen away as time has gone on. I mean, the same night that the vote happened, their promises started falling away. Whereas Project Fear, while not necessarily demonstrating everything to the fullest extent, many of the claims that made have proven to be true. The economic damage, the employment damage, the inflationary damage, all of that. So yeah, it turned out to be project pretty fucking prescient, and as it turned out. So that there's all of that, and there's the personal cost that I am seeing to friends and family of this going on. It's all the Europeans living here and all the Brits living abroad that have no real idea how things are going to shake out. It's not fair or good for them, and there doesn't seem to be any good reason for leave, as I've kind of briefly covered before. So everything has fallen away. I don't recall there should be sufficient insulin being scrawled across the side of a bus at any point during the Leave campaign. So everything's fallen away. All that's left is, and now we're just supposed to believe in Brexit for some reason. It's not fucking Tinkerbell.
Well, I guess my concern is that the European Union is a shrinking percentage of world GDP, and if we remain tied to the EU, are we not part of that?
Right, so this part of the discussion was about oil prices. So the EU negotiates with OPEC on behalf of all its members. So you have a kind of collective degree of might and bargaining power there. So they determine the prices for the next 3 years for the EU as a whole, and then local governments add their duties and tariffs and whatever else it is that they feel that they want to on that. So as a result of negotiating as part of that bloc, there's more leverage, a stronger unit, a stronger bloc, and so all member states benefit from that. And this is one part of one aspect of the economic argument for remaining in the EU. Now, Sargon's argument here appears to be that the EU as an economic bloc is shrinking as a percentage of global GDP, which is valid, but that's really only because other areas are growing faster at the moment. But the EU is a very old, very developed economy, so you wouldn't expect there to be too much in the way of explosive growth and shifts and changes. So that's not a particularly good line of argument to make in the first place. But then it's a terrible argument for leaving, because Britain removing itself from the EU is then an even smaller aspect of global GDP without being wedded to this larger bloc and having the oomph and bargaining power that that bloc has. So if the logic followed that a shrinking overall GDP of the European Union area, made it weaker, then us leaving and being even smaller makes us even weaker. So it doesn't stay consistent within its own argument. So it's a bad reason for Brexit.
Well, yeah, but proportionally it's shrinking in importance, isn't it?
Yeah, part of the reason for that is that the EU have agreements with a lot of other countries. They just signed a free trade agreement with Japan in the last few days. So therefore, trade with, say, Japan is likely to increase much faster than it's likely to increase within the EU. If we leave the EU, we lose all those trade agreements.
Sure, but we could always make new ones, couldn't we?
So all this time that Brexit has been rolling on, the EU has been continuing to make free trade agreements. Japan was mentioned here. I believe Canada was another one. The EU has 36 free trade agreements with the rest of the world, and there isn't actually really anything to stop you making trade agreements outside the EU. We just haven't, particularly. And when you're part of the EU, if those trade agreements are made through the EU, with the EU, on behalf of the EU, then you again have that huge block of bargaining power, those potential markets and so on, which can tip the scales in your favour in any deal that you make. Now, Britain is a large economy on a global scale, but taken apart from Europe, it's going to be smaller and still have less bargaining power, less ability to score concessions and so on, and to get the kinds of deals that would truly benefit us. Plus, we're going to have to start over from scratch, and we simply don't have the diplomatic and financial staff within the government anymore to do this, because it was all handled by Europe. They have been hiring people on like crazy to prepare and get ready. There's also an extremely high level of turnover and burnout amongst diplomats, fiscal advisors, and so on, that would have to make these deals going forward. So we would be starting from a much weaker position, having to renegotiate many opportunities and deals which we already have on a more favourable basis through the EU. So while technically we could make new deals, this would take years and would not likely be anything like as favourable as the ones that already exist.
The question I have is, are you concerned about the stability of the European Union at all? What with the increase of right-wing populist parties, the fault lines generating along, and then the southern European debt crises that's still going on that no one seems to talk about? Do you think it's a good future for the European Union?
Yeah, definitely.
This is a bit of a weird and disingenuous argument, I think, coming from Sargon. And I ran into the same argument the other day. If you were genuinely concerned about the rise of the far right and so on, why would you join a party that is at the extreme right edge of the British Overton window? And how does capitulating to and indulging the far right by proceeding with the Brexit, particularly a hard or no deal Brexit, how does that do anything to increase stability? You can think of it in terms of inertia. Bigger things take more energy to move one way or the other, and the Brits have traditionally done change and political shifting and so on slowly, in part due to the fact that we're a conglomeration of different nations. The EU isn't particularly different. The Gilets jaunes, they're not as big as people seem to think they are or claim they are. They're big in Paris and a few other cities, but otherwise not particularly. In the countryside and so on, less so it would seem. At least that's what I hear from people who, at least for now, are able to live in Europe. And it's this weird conglomeration of far right, far left, and other peculiar activists. And they now have a rival organisation, Red Scarves. So rioting is the French national pastime. So who can tell? The rise of the far right in Europe, why would we want to empower them by leaving? The problems in southern Europe, well, we're helping them. I know this is a controversial position to hold, but we're helping them, bailing them out, helping keep those countries going and preventing them from falling into a collapse. And in exchange, there's some outside oversight and control over what has been terrible corruption in the past. So that seems like a good thing. And don't forget that the former Greek finance minister came out against Brexit. So there you go. I think stability is best encouraged by staying stable, by not indulging the far right. If we're genuinely worried about their rise in Europe, we should stay in Europe, where we can use our veto powers and what has historically, if not currently, been our relative state of level-headedness to help, keep things even and stop the boat from rocking too much. Of course, there's a flip side to that argument. If we leave and stop blockading everything, Europe may become more agile and better able to cope with some of these things. Comme ci, comme ça.
But it seems that the second biggest contributors leaving, seems that there are massively Eurosceptic movements gaining ground all over Europe. It doesn't look very stable.
There is no doubt that us leaving the EU will do damage to the EU, but it's nothing compared to the damage that it will do to the UK. They'll take a hit, but it's an absorbable hit. So, the year before the Brexit vote, the one running up to that, our total contributions after everything back and forth was around 9 billion, and the conservative estimate of what membership in the EU was worth to the UK was around 62 billion. So, we essentially paid in 9 and got back 62. So, a net overall gain to the UK economy of about 53 billion pounds. So if we put that in context, and we have somehow that has to be covered again, the UK could pay twice as much, 3 times as much, 4 times as much, and it would still be worth us being part of the EU in terms of the overall benefit to our economy. So I think you can see that while, it'll cause a bit of a slowdown, a bit of a problem in terms of costs being spread around the rest of the EU, it's not as big of a cost as you might have otherwise thought, and the gains far, far, far outweigh the costs.
A bit more.
I don't think they're going to like that. I mean, even while receiving money from the European Union, Poland and Hungary are pretty... it's France, Germany, Italy and Britain who are the major net contributors, and we're leaving. We're the second highest. It seems that the Italians are probably not going to want to pay that. The French probably aren't going to want to pay that.
5% of the budget.
If you believe the UK can survive a no-deal Brexit, and you have advocated for that in the past, I don't know what your current position is, but if you believe the UK can survive that, a contraction of 10% in our economy, then I think the EU spreading that cost and keeping in mind that the EU budget is a small percentage of each country's actual budget, so it represents a far, far smaller contraction. If you think we can take it in a much worse context, in a worse situation, and a much larger percentage of damage to our economy, and you believe that that's worth it, then I think it's inconsistent to say that they won't be able to cope when it's going to be a fraction of that once you've spread it all around, and when you consider it in context of what these countries pay in and out of the EU as a percentage of their own internal state finances. So this doesn't seem to hold water to me.
I guess my concern would be the demonstrable drive towards a federalised European superstate seems to be anti-sovereignty. What do you think on that?
As I kind of spelled out earlier, I don't see the sovereignty argument as being one that holds water. It just seems to be this kind of thought-terminating cliche, this shibboleth that people trot out without considering what it actually means. So long as Europe and any putative future federal state is democratic, then there is no loss of sovereignty. We participate just the same way as Dave from Liverpool doesn't impinge on my sovereignty down here in northwest Hampshire. It makes no difference in terms of sovereignty. We both participate, we take part in the rules making that goes on at that level. So this just doesn't seem to make any sense. Now, speaking personally, I see no problem whatsoever with the federal states of Europe. I would like that to happen. I would like that to be the end goal. And eventually, perhaps, as a more enlightened species, we could have hemispheric governments, or even one single world government, where global decisions take place on a global level, regional and a global sense issues, decisions, those take place at that level, and so on down. That's what I would like to see, decisions being made at the levels at which it makes sense to make those decisions, and a federated European state makes sense to me. But if you're against a federal Europe, if you want to pump the brakes on that, or the potential EU army or whatever else, and I don't really understand why people are against that either. It would save us all a hell of a lot of money, which could then be channeled into worthwhile projects rather than pointless replication of effort when it comes to weaponry and so on. So I don't understand that either. But yeah, if you're against that, then you should want Britain to remain part of Europe, where we can use our veto powers and various other things that we won't get if we rejoin, to put the kibosh on these ideas, to pump the brakes and be a voice of sanity from your point of view. Because once we leave, that removes a lot of the blocks to these kind of things that you think are dangerous or wrong-headed, and you'll no longer have any leverage or means to have any say about it.
Yeah, but my concern is when you make a treaty with, say, Russia or Japan or China or whatever it was, they won't then dictate our laws to us, whereas the European Union does impose laws on Britain. Something like 20,000 in the last 20 years, something like that.
The EU doesn't impose laws on us any more than our national government does. We participate in a democratic process, the results of which we agree with over 90% of the time. That comes up with laws, but only at the appropriate level, via the agreements that we've all made to be part of the EU, and the votes that we've participated in, the arguments that we've made at all the democratic levels of the EU. Now, if you're going to argue that the EU is undemocratic, we have far bigger issues much closer to home.
Hang on though, the problem I have is the Commission proposes legislation, and I don't get to control who's on the Commission. So I have a concern about that. Do you have any concerns about that?
The EU Commission is somewhere between the civil service and the executive, that is the cabinet in this country. You do not choose any civil servants, and you do not directly elect anyone to the cabinet, not even the Prime Minister. And in our country, being a constitutional monarchy, you don't even vote for the President, or in our case, the Queen. That's hereditary. And then there's Lords and so on. Yeah. Basically, if you have an issue with the EU being undemocratic, there are much, much bigger problems, much closer to home. That said, the EU Commission is far more democratically responsive than these bodies in our own governments. So the EU Commission is made up of 28 commissioners, one for each country. They self-select their presidents and so on from amongst themselves, but each commissioner, while they're not supposed to directly represent their country, is proposed by their country, is put forward, is nominated, is put into their position by their country. Who in that country does that? Well, the elected government. So you've had your democratic say in what led to the selection of the government in your country, in this case Britain, and then that government appoints a commissioner to the commission. So that's more democratic, or at least as democratic as these things in our home system. So if you're concerned about the EU in this way, you should be concerned about the UK government first, probably.
I mean, my concern, though, is that the Commission appears to act as the sovereign body, and we have no method of adding or removing commissioners, and we have no method of compelling them to table legislation, whereas here we can send MPs to the Parliament to do it.
Yeah, but
Contrary to what a lot of people seem to think, the Commission, to which we can appoint and remove commissioners as a national government, we have one each, it's not the only body that can do it. It's the primary body that can introduce legislation. Other bodies can introduce legislation, but the Commission has to approve of it. But that's not the only way change can be done, or that legislation can be introduced. The Council of Ministers, which is made up directly rather than indirectly of members of the governments that each individual state has elected, can do the same. And that's weighted by population and so on. So, that kind of favours us quite a bit as the UK, or did. And then the European Parliament has to approve any legislation. It can just block it indefinitely, and more importantly, it can introduce amendments and so on, so it can add to or remove from what has been put forward by the Commission. And the European Parliament can also propose legislation. It just has to be cleared by one of these other bodies first. So it can happen, and the overall direction of change has been to make that directly elected body, the European Parliament, more powerful, more responsible, to give it more capacity in terms of these kind of things as time has gone on. Future reforms are likely to reflect that. The last section kind of gets sidetracked into talking about climate change and pollution in the developing world and things like that, to which the EU argument is that as a larger bloc we have more leverage, we can demand more of our trading partners, and big issues like climate change and so on, like world wars, take collective action on a much larger scale than we used to as individual nations. It took allies, it took planned economies, things like that, to deal with war issues, and this is at least as big of an issue. Feel free to disagree, but that's the argument. But it seems irrelevant to me. Now, the thing about Brexit and about the UK, I think, this is the kind of point that I want to end on, is that the EU has been blamed constantly and consistently for everything, most of which is down to local policies and issues. There is no doubt from the maths that our membership in the EU is to a great advantage to us. It takes a peculiar redefinition of sovereignty in the way that, for example, racism and sexism has been redefined to plus power and so on, to think that we don't have sovereignty as part of this structure. So these are local problems being blamed on an external force that perhaps hasn't done the best job of explaining itself or showing in which ways it has helped us. It's invisible to a big degree, and that's unfortunate. It's going to be especially unfortunate for the people in the really heavily pro-leave areas, who sometimes, often even, the only investment into these relatively deprived areas came from the EU. That's going to disappear, and it's not going to be replaced, or at least not replaced by anything like as much. But that, I think, cuts to the heart of the problem. The benefits of being a member of the EU, the benefits that have come from immigration to a degree and so on, these haven't been spread around. Only a relatively select handful of people, ironically many of them the same people that stand to benefit from betting against the country for Brexit, those are the people that have benefited. And the normal person on the ground hasn't necessarily seen that. Or there's all this money coming in as a result of us being part of the EU, immigrants paying in as much as 1.5 times as much as they take out, depending which survey, but always more than they take out, even in the most pessimistic scenarios. But none of that gets seen at the local level. People don't appreciate that the doctors and nurses are immigrants. People don't appreciate the tax money that they put in because they're not seeing it. So we need to remain, but we also need to reform. We need to reform the EU to make it even more democratic than it already is. We need to reform our democracy at home. And we need to make sure that the benefits of being in the EU, the benefits of migration and so on, are more evenly distributed, so that these deprived areas get investment off taxes that we can raise from the prosperity that being in the EU brings relative to not being in the EU. And we need to let people know that these benefits exist, this money exists, and we need to put it into these areas. I have an old video where I talk about the Battle of Cable Street and how that actually helped the far right, because they were seen to be level-headed and pulled away to prevent causing any more fuss and so on. And this was a big boost to them at a time that they were losing a lot of support. What actually finally undid the British Union of Fascists and other groups like that was not street battles. That did quite the opposite. What really changed things was the government deciding to invest in deprived areas to help raise them out of poverty, to make them less desperate, to make them less likely to play the blame game when they could be seen to be gaining the benefits that the rest of society was. That's what we need to do again. We need to reinvest in our people, in our deprived communities. Brexit is going to do the opposite of that. And that's far more of a threat of raising the spectre of the far right than remaining in. Which isn't to say any path from this point on is going to be easy or short of acrimony. Zang.